Well, I think we left off yesterday talking a little bit about how in Francis's conversion experiences, we might get caught up in seeing some of our own image of that, and maybe to even begin to reflect on how and what are the important moments of our conversion. We spoke a little bit, we located Francis historically, we located the expression of Franciscan life in its four primary movements. We spoke a little bit about how the Word of God so took hold of Francis's life that he desired nothing but that, and that his whole formation around his response to that was not to do anything but to follow in the exact footsteps of Christ, right? And to walk in the footsteps of Christ, in the vestigio of Christ, to walk in the footsteps of Christ. We talked about how his devotion to this resulted in a new form of religious life, the vita mixta, right? That it was not monastic and that it was not apostolic, and that there is, and we'll talk about that a little bit today, that the only goal of Franciscan fraternity, fraternitas, is to give witness. It isn't about apostolic ministry, it isn't about doing anything. It is really about being the alter Christus. It is about being the other Christ. It is about providing witness. Father Jason spoke a little bit about our habits and how people are drawn to us by these habits, and how there's a saying in religious life that the cow doesn't make the monk. And so that who we are inside must be transformed as well as by our outsides as well, right? And so when we give witness to the gospel life by what is supposed to be the simplicity of our dress, we should really be saying to the world in many ways that we come here as Christ. We come here as other Christ. We don't come here to do anything sometimes except to be with you and meet you where you are, right? So we spoke a little bit about that yesterday. We talked about how Francis began in many ways to live out his conversion in ways that resulted in probably a very radical reform, beginning reform of the church. I found a book in the library that I had a lot of influence on my prayer life when I was in prep school. It was Prayers by Michael Coist, and he's a French author, and it was written in Le Havre in like 1954. But in this prayer, and it was very radical for us at the time, since most of our prayers were very formulaic, and this was not. This suggested that maybe we could have a dialogue with God about the telephone conversation that we just had with someone, or that we could have a dialogue with God about the deepest places of our sorrow. And I was looking at that a little bit last night, and I was thinking that maybe that's how Francis becomes for us the vernacular theologian. Maybe when we put on the mind of Christ the way that Francis did, that then we see the God in everything. Then we are moved in different ways in our very being to respond to the world in which we live in. And that results for us in a different spirit, in a different way of being in the world. It results in a transformation. It results in us being turned to the Lord very gradually, right? And then as Claire, in her contemplation, it results in us having this long, loving gaze towards the mirror of our perfection, which is Christ, right? So I don't know, does that sound like a good recap of what we did? Does any of that sound familiar? Right? So you're all not along with me for a while, right? Absolutely. All right. Maybe we'll continue a little bit where we left off yesterday, and to say in many ways that our Franciscan spirituality begins with listening. I think it begins with listening. I don't want to miss the point that if we follow in the footsteps of Jesus, the footsteps of Jesus lead us to Calvary. And so there's an important dimension of our Franciscan life which revolves around the cross. And so the prayer that Francis taught all of the friars to say on entering a church was what? We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you in all the tabernacles in the world. It's the prayer that we say at the end of the benediction. But also on Good Friday, we have the antiphon, which we say, we adore you, O Christ, and we bless you because by your holy cross you have redeemed the world, right? And so that becomes a powerful prayer for Francis. And so we cannot miss the point that listening to the Word of God and following in the footsteps of Jesus leads us to embrace the cross. And for Francis, the embracing of the cross was done with great joy in the context of fraternity and with some minority. But we also know, as Francis did, that our story doesn't end on Calvary, right? It begins on Easter morning. There's a wonderful author, is a member of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, Ronald Rolheiser, and he wrote a book called Holy Longing. It's a phenomenal book on spirituality. And in this book, Holy Longing, he suggests that there's a six-fold movement of spiritual change for us. And I was thinking about that, and Francis and maybe some of the later writers, I think William Short does a bit of a job of identifying what these 6 stages might be in terms of a gospel or a biblical conversion. And it suggests that the first is that we have to have our own Gethsemanes, that each and every one of us come to a place in which we struggle profoundly with something that we have to let go of. And we might pray as Christ did, and as Francis was struggling with his encounters with following God, where he lingered for a bit, right? We might pray, please let this cup pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. And so that there is the surrender then to the will of God. And the way that Francis sees us surrendering to the will of God is to pay attention to what are the words of God. How do we hear that? So to engage that the word of God then sustains us in all of the moments of our conversion. It is a biblical conversion. Jeremiah and Isaiah, all of those talked about these conversion experiences. And so Francis knew that. And so what sustains the conversion? What happens if we decide to change our minds and that nothing sustains that change of mind for us? So Francis saw what sustained us was this constant Lectio Divina, this constant prayerful reading of the Word of God, this constant reflection on the Word of God. And so we have our Gethsemanes, and we struggle, and we find maybe ourselves situated in the Scriptures, and maybe one of the psalmist expressions. And then after our Gethsemane, we move to Calvary. And whatever that is that we have to let go of, we have to be crucified to. And so we embrace the cross. For Francis, it was with great joy. When Father Jason read the story yesterday of Francis coming from, was it Rome? Was it Perugia? And the icicles were digging into his habit, and he was talking about this would be perfect joy. Perhaps our crosses is the acceptance of all of the circumstances of our life without any desire to change that. And so that's what perfect joy is. If I can, Francis was saying, if I can accept the rejection of my own community when I am most in need of that, and accept that as the will of God for me, then I can find joy in that. It won't always, I think, be happy. I'm sure he was, sometimes we're still cold and hungry, right? And so, but it is in the beginning of I think it's in the beginning of the acceptance of our own frailty that we stand most in need of God's love for us. And so then we have our crucifixion. Then we have our resurrection morning. And I think that's where much of the Francis is the Fioretti of Francis, the little flowers of Francis, where we hear how Francis would go around playing the air violin. Do you know that, Anthony? He played the air violin. He didn't have one, the fiddle. He thought that he did. And in many ways, who knows what that process was for Francis. He had his resurrection morning, most certainly.